We welcome you all back for the session 2 for the 7th Founders Day celebration. It's now time to have a thought-provoking panel discussion on the topic of workforce management in academia.
We feel that for any academic endeavor to be successful, there is a great need to maintain good communication and coordination amongst the personnel involved. A good performance, not only in a corporate sector, but also in academic background, mostly depends on how effectively an individual or a group coordinate the workforce available. To discuss on this important topic, we have 4 eminent panelists representing different perspectives.
We now welcome our panelists onto the stage. Starting with Professor Satyajit Mayer, former Director and Scientist, NCBS. Dr. Indumati Mariyappan, a Research Scientist in LV Prasad Eye Institute. Dr. Ridesh Dikshit, GM, Biologics Business Operations, Syngene International Limited. Annapurna PK, a PhD student from CSIR CCMB.
This session will be moderated by Dr. Somdatta Karak, Science Communication and Outreach Officer, CSIR CCMB. We now request Dr. Somdatta to brief the audience about today's topic of panel discussion, introduce our panelists, and take over the session. Over to you, Dr. Somdatta.
Good morning, everyone. So, today's discussion is going to be around how do we manage workforce in academia. And we do so because academia is one of the very few structured spaces where exploration is encouraged. Most discussions with science academics suggest that it is the sense of exploration and freedom that excite them to be in the academic space. At the same time, academia is becoming more and more dependent on projects running on grants with tight deadlines and timelines. Added to that are numerous problems of bureaucracy and material procurement in a country like ours. These have been changing altogether the way human resource management has been done or is being done in science academia today. And not all of these changes have been for the betterment of the community. Mental health issues have been on the rise, ability to focus on deep questions has been impacted, and those at the bottom of the pyramid are the most severely affected, so say the community. These are the concerns that we want to focus on today in our discussion. I'm Somdatta, the moderator of the discussion, and joining me panelists are representing different stages and sides of academia as well as industry. In the discussion today, we'll try to identify some of the key problems that academics face, if they're unique to their career stages, and if we can identify some good practices from other sectors such as industry, but not limited to industry. And overall, deliberate on how academia stays a fertile ground for fresh ideas. We'll start today with Annapurna PK, a PhD student at CCMB who studies the biology of depression. She's a vocal advocate for mental health issues and wants to work towards removing the taboos associated with discussing them, and has written about it on various different platforms. She'll represent today the PhD student community in our discussion. We have Dr. Indumati Mariyappan, a research scientist at LV Prasad Eye Institute. Indumati has seen the Indian academic system from various different angles, from her training at Tamil Nadu's Agricultural University to a national research lab at CCMB to now at a private research institute associated with a hospital at LVPI. She is given the honors of speaking on behalf of the mid-career scientists of Indian life sciences. We have Dr. Ridesh Dikshit, General Manager of Syngene International, and also an ex-PhD student of CCMB. In his current role, he looks at business strategy, financial strategy, manpower planning, acquisitions, and infrastructure expansions. He brings in experience from various reputed industries and will be telling us how workforce management happens in the industry. And we have Professor Satyajit Mayer, a very celebrated scientist at the National Center for Biological Sciences, and who just stepped down from the director position at the center. He has seen NCBS and the Bangalore Life Science Cluster grow into a very unique ecosystem where they have fostered blue sky research and translation both very well. Satyajit will represent the senior academic community, including those who are at leadership positions, who are at the helm of decision making in academia. At the very onset, I must acknowledge that we have not been able to include representation from the short-term students and the postdoc community particularly. While that has been due to some of our constraints, I would definitely encourage you all in the audience to ask your questions to us in the discussion. We will also be sharing some sheets. Sharda and Aishwarya will be sharing 2 sheets if you wish to write your questions anonymously. Today's discussion will start with some questions from my end for the panelists, which will be for roughly 30 minutes, and then we'll open the discussion for you all, the questions that you can ask directly or through the sheets that we'll be sharing with you. It will be this collective interaction through which I hope will shape the conclusions we make today in the discussion. I would like to start with Annapurna, stating some of the key problems that the PhD student community face, and we'll be following that with Indumati and Satyajit.
So I'll talk about 3 points primarily. First of all, thanks to the organizers for making this happen and for Somdatta for moderating. So the first point I want to talk about is at the institution level. So as students, a lot of us feel, and I should mention that I'm not speaking from my perspective alone. I actually went on, I made a tweet asking the students to give me some answers at what would they want a representative to speak about. So what I'm saying is from those replies and also some people who told me some things personally. So a lot of students feel that the redressal mechanisms that exist in institutes and universities, they're not always sound. So there are committees, there are places to place complaints in case there's a conflict, either between students or between student and their PI. But a lot of times it is the junior most, be it the student-PI relationship or a senior-junior student, it is always the junior most that get the short end of the stick. So which probably is understandable seeing how academia works, because PIs, like we can consider them as partners in an institute, but they bring in the money. So, but it is unfair to the students. So how do we deal with this? That is one point. The second point I want to talk about is specifically at the lab level. So a lot of students have told me that they're PIs, definitely not the case every time, but a lot of PIs don't communicate their expectations well at the outset. Like how many publications do they expect? How long is it likely to take? And also, a lot of us have noticed that in the first, second year, the PIs, they don't impress upon us the importance of publications and consistent work. So, like, we've heard statements like, oh, you're still in the first year, there's still time. And suddenly when you're in your fourth year, they're like, on your back, ski, get the work done. So it shouldn't be that way. We should be encouraged to do consistent and regular work from the beginning. So that is one. And also, a lot of PIs excessively rely on their students for some administrative work, like placing orders and procurement. It's important that we learn those things, especially if we plan to come back to academia. It's an important thing, but it should not be entirely the student's responsibility. It should be a dialogue, like the PI and student have to work together even on that. So that's one, institute level and lab level. And the third point I'd like to say, since you mentioned that we don't really have a representative from the trainees and the JRFs that we have, or the temporary students that we have, so I'd like to put across a point from their side that a lot of them feel underutilized, and some of them are actually unpaid. So like unpaid labor in academia is very common, and a lot of us don't even think of it much. But it's incorrect. We shouldn't do that. We shouldn't expect students to work and put in hours with no payment. So that is one. And also a lot of times trainees and JRFs, they're just treated as helping hands. They are not given intellectual freedom to actually contribute to the projects. So that are the couple of issues that from their end that I'd like to put across. So that's all from me.
So setting the expectations right at the onset is something that I see as a large problem that we are focusing, we are trying to talk about. Indumati, would you like to go ahead?
So as a early mid-career scientist, the pain points in the lab I would put as identifying right people and frame the right team. A successful team, build a successful team for yourself is the biggest challenge, because if it is a big established centers, you will always get the best will come to the best places. But if you are in a limited or a small institute where you have the onus of setting up an independent lab, and as a young PI, it's very difficult. Even within a small institute, people would want to join a person who's already established and have a proven track record. But here you're starting as an independent. First challenge is to prove yourself as an independent, capable of guiding an independent research program and convincing people to fund you, to join you and work as a part of the team. So that is something that is a biggest pain point to begin with, at least in the first 2-3 years of the career, till you establish yourself as an independent researcher, successful independent researcher. Second is keeping your workforce motivated and guiding them through, because you as a PI, new PI, you have the responsibility of setting up the lab, starting from the scratch, provided unless you have the lab already set up and you have joined an established environment. But if it is a small environment, then you have the additional onus of setting up a lab from the scratch. Then in that case, not only you, but also the people who are going to join you will be participating in the process. So in the process, there will be excessive workforce, like what she was telling in terms of participation in other lab management activities. So it can be looked at as a burden from the student side, because it might take away your research time. At the same time, it might be delaying your career progress because it will take time for you to submit. So these are considerations when a student joins a new faculty, like am I in a better position to join this lab or not? So these are something that you have to tackle, and how you tackle is an important point to keep your workforce motivated and grow along with them and let them grow along with you. So that's another thing. Third thing is, as young faculties, early mid-career, we are either starting our families or we are just young parents, be it male or female, and balancing the workforce, balancing your time management and setting targets and meeting the demands is another thing, which are three important things that as young faculties we find difficulty. So we'll talk about this more in detail as we go through.
Thank you very much. So as I see, you are talking about two primary things. One is attracting. So you're talking about two primary things. One is attracting the right kind of talent and retaining them and growing with them. The other is a more personal front of the early mid-career researchers, where they're also starting a family and a right kind of support system for that. Thanks. Satyajit, would you want to talk about what are the kinds of challenges that the leadership faces? And I think leadership is also at the position where they have to keep everybody happy. So there are these funding bodies, national bodies that you are answerable to. At the same time, you have PIs who have a set of expectations. And then there are students who are the youngest and need a very different kind of ground for fostering them. So how does the leadership How do people at leadership positions deal with all of these, and what kinds of challenges that you need to face generally?
Thanks, Odita. Well, at the outset, you make it sound extremely difficult. But I must confess that I think the most crucial aspect of being able to manage expectations and being able to create an atmosphere or a work atmosphere which is, one, respectful of everyone, two, has the interests of, I would say, as you mentioned, the bottom of the pyramid at the forefront, and three, the capacity to be able to deal with many of the things that Annapurna just brought up, as well as Indumati, because those are real problems, and those problems, unless the institution is able to create structures and mechanisms to deal with, they are the ones that are going to generate all the difficulties as you go ahead. So from an institutional point of view, I think managing the funding bodies and all that is a completely different perspective, and those concerns should not be transferred to the people who are working within the institution. I mean, from an institution perspective, I think that's the responsibility of the administration, the leadership. The internal functioning of a system needs attention, and it needs care and commitment, and I should say fair process, where there is an involvement from everyone. Now, I mean, we can dissect these things that I mentioned, break them down into what precisely these processes are, but I mean, we can do that, as a matter of conversation. So I will just stop with that. Yeah? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now let's, take thoughts from Hridesh, who has seen the academic space and also has seen the industry space extensively, while Annapurna, Indumati and Satyajit have brought out the problems in a very broad sense. Do you see the same generality of problems in industry, and how does industry go about it? And then we'll come back to these three people who are in academia to hear what kinds of structures exist in academia to deal with those.
So if I talk about how industry deals with a lot of these situations, so first, some of the points what Annapurna brought in, they're more around conflict management, and they are more about, getting diverse experience in the same area, and it is also about communication. And these are very fundamental human behaviors. So when in industry, these are played very important role. Communication, if I talk about, there are regular trainings which are given at all level, and there are various levels on reaching the communication, and it is also always said that sometime you may be doing a great work, whether it is a leader or somebody reporting to the person, but communication is the key between two people, and they need to communicate as much as possible. So that's about now conflict management. If I just see, yes, there are certain practices and which people need to follow, and they need to understand under which situation what kind of conflict management practice will be applicable. They need to use that, and again there are trainings. So I think on the soft skill there are a lot of emphasis goes on the training. So that's about addressing issues on this side. Now how industry sets up their manpower, it is typically driven by certain vision, and industry often changes their structures once in every 2 to 3 years if the need is there, sometimes even more frequently. Now whether they're on a very high growth trajectory, if they're on a very high growth trajectory, then they will strengthen the the resources in a way that whatever it takes, because time is the key there, cost is not the key. You have to achieve something in 2 years, and you just make everything possible for that. So you create different layer of talent, different layer of structures, more environment where innovation can take place. While if your focus is on the cost, you bring down, so your leadership gets lean, but your bottom of the pyramid gets diverse, and so you reach on the cost side. And if some of the mechanism where they realize the bureaucracy is kind of taking place, then they create certain structures where the manager is going to be more a administrative manager, and all the technical things are managed by a technical project manager. So the thing when some of the bureaucracy takes in place, when the the administrator himself is also responsible for technical aspect, that's where the center of power gets kind of concentrated. So this is one way of diversifying that. And of course there is another mechanism which industry uses, which is called 360-degree feedback, where about any person, irrespective of their profile, all their peers, all their juniors, all the stakeholders, everyone is asked to give anonymous feedback, and you collate all the feedback, and then it only gets published to the HR and the leadership, which is at a management level, and then they kind of work out what sort of development plan at individual is requiring. So there are different mechanisms which industry operates.
Thank you. So, all three of you, do you see some similarities in the way things are structured in academia already with how industry operates, or they're not there because of certain reasons of academia? Whoever wants to go first.
I can say something. I think the point that Hridesh mentioned about the nature of work in industry, which is sort of, has to be quick on its feet, has to respond very quickly to changing demands from the shareholders or board or whoever, is perhaps somewhat buffered in the academic setup. There is academic research in general has a long-term vision, and therefore I think strategies in the academic environment, especially in institutions which are catering to academic research, need to be somewhat well thought through, but they perhaps are not as challenging as what one might see in terms of managing a so-called workforce, because you do have a long-term perspective and you can work to ensure the issues that are brought up are actually built and dealt with systems that can be consistent with the requirement of this long-term strategy. Now, having said that, I mean, some of the issues that that can be addressed are through structural mechanisms, like for early career researchers and for families. I think it's very, very important to have extremely good support on the campus. Very good, say, a creche. I mean, I must say, building a creche on our campus was perhaps the best thing that happened to young early career people, and I think it immediately changed the perspective of many of our young staff, many of our young faculty, of how they could contribute more to their own work and to their own research. So that's what I'm saying, structural. I mean, it's just a small example. In terms of handling the issues of conflict resolution and say mental health, mental well-being, I think one needs today, especially, a very sensitive environment and very sensitive structures as well. You need to have I would have to say a battery of professional counselors, a system of people who are willing to listen, and also extremely confidential but very effective conflict management issues. But these need to be structural. There's individuals who are in the workplace need to know that these are available, and so a good, effective, one similarity is that a good, effective communication strategy about these things needs to also be in place. That's perhaps the place where I see the largest similarity, that a good communication strategy is necessary regardless.
Can you please elaborate on what these communication
So communication strategy, for example, if you have, say, a fresh recruit, whether it's a faculty or a student or a staff, how do they begin to understand the culture of the campus? How do they begin to understand the culture of the place where they're working? That requires a kind of, there's a question, no. That requires a kind of communication of the goals and aspirations of the institution and how they can map to what the individual wants. And that communication has to happen in multiple levels, right? Right from the leadership to the first level of the person, this individual working. If it's an intern, it has to happen with the student in the lab and the PI in the lab. If it's a person in the staff, it has to happen with their line manager, right? So that communication and how that happens is absolutely essential, and it has to happen when the individual comes in. You can't wait, for 2 years and have this person discover all this for themselves, because the ethos of the place will change, right? So that's what I meant by communication, and that's interpersonal communication. There also needs to be some way of having communication of what needs to happen on a campus distributed across various means of communication, either it's social media or websites or even teams of people who take on this task. And those are again structural in some sense, but they need strategies. conflict resolution, I think, is a lot of this is about different styles of engagement and a lack, in some sense, especially of power hierarchies, where staff or faculty deal with their subordinates in inappropriate ways, and handling that requires a very sensitive engagement, because you can't afford to lose staff, you can't afford to lose your young colleagues and make them feel disempowered. Right? So empowerment of the younger colleagues, I think, in order to be able to come forward to address conflicts, to me is very, very, very important. And if that empowerment doesn't happen, then it doesn't matter what structure you put in place. Right? So, I'll leave it at that.
So I agree with both Hitesh and Satyajit, where they emphasized on the importance of communication. So open and clear communication is the key for any conflict resolving. So I would rather talk about, rather than the institution level conflict, maybe micromanagement within the lab if there are any conflicts, and to avoid conflicts, the key is to communicate with the students. Like when you have a student, set the goals clearly, explain the projects very clearly to them. What are the expectations? What are the key things that need to be done? If they understand these things early on, right when they start, and engage them in the project writing and proposal writing when you are putting together these ideas, then their participation will be very clear, and the roadmap is also very clear. There's no confusion. You don't really have to wait till the last minute for the pressures to build in, that you have to deliver, and now I'm not able to because the direction was not clear from day one. So that's something that, as young faculties, when people go out, many of you will be setting up your own labs, and that's something that you need to ensure that you communicate these things very clearly to the students, and also provide the enough support system in terms of guiding them and training them. So training is another thing. Like if it is an established lab, you have enough seniors there in the lab who can handhold you and train you on all that techniques that you have to learn, because many of us come out of MSc and we are not trained in all the advanced techniques that you will be handling as part of the PhD. So those trainings will come from your students. But in a new lab, the PI should put in that enough 2-3 years of initial effort, wherein you set the example for them, show them exactly how things have to be done, and that effort and time have to be invested in the beginning and be prepared for that. So that kind of helps them to know the limits of the lab, what is the focus in the lab, and helps them to get themselves aligned to the lab requirement. So that's something that helps in setting the direction or for the people in the lab. And for the conflict resolvement, again, micro communication, talk to people directly. If there is any problem that you have, approach your PI. If it is not PI related problems, explain. It can be a personal problem or a professional problem, talk to them. And if it is other which your PI cannot handle or PI shouldn't be involved, you should be aware of what is the addressal mechanisms that the institute have. Like you have your own students forum or students welfare committee. So be aware of that and approach them at the right time. Don't wait for disaster to happen. So that's something that as a student in a new place, be aware of all of this and approach people at the right time for help. Don't be hesitant in asking for help.
Yeah, so I think everyone talked about communication, and I completely agree about that. I'll circle back to one point that Hitesh made, the 360-degree feedback. So actually, this is one of the points that came up from a lot of students, that we don't have a two-way feedback or like a 360-degree feedback in academia. Like students get feedback when they get recommendations from their PI and other mentors, but students or like, let's say, junior faculty, they don't have any fora to, let's say, give a feedback to their seniors. So that, I think, is a major lacuna in academia. I think a lot of students would agree, because if there is an anonymous 360-degree feedback, only then the leadership and the management can recognize what are the issues in our system, and they can build upon it to improve the system. So I think that is something that's seriously lacking, and we should look towards implementing it. And also one point that Dr. Mayer made about mental health and how there should be structured ways of handling it in an institute. I think NCBS has set a very good example in the past couple of years, that they have regular workshops on mental health. Experts from outside come in, give talks. In fact, the links for those talks are made public. I mean, I have attended a few of those. So I think those kind of systems should be implemented in institutes and universities across. And I think institutes should learn from each other. So if one has done something of that sort, others should look at implementing it as well. And definitely the effort has to come from upper management, because students can push for it, but unless people like Professor Mayer take the effort, I don't think it will actually get implemented.
So because there's been so much of emphasis on communication, it makes me feel as though the individuals who are extroverted would have an advantage over it. And introverts have expressed that concern over and over again, that there are not enough mechanisms for them to fit into the system in various different ways. And that is where I might want to think about the various training or orientation programs that different organizations are arranging for these days. One that comes to my mind right away is the EMBO India Alliance together do a training program for the PIs to know how to manage their students in lab, the people in their labs. So would Satyajit or Indumati be able to shed some light on how effective those programs are, or where do those programs need improvisation, or what kinds of things do we need to have in place so that more academics, more PIs opt to go for such programs, if they're valuable at all?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, those programs, I think, are extremely valuable. The EMBO India Alliance engagement has created some structured, ways of lab leadership and lab management. I think the gaps there seem to be more about looking at specificity in terms of what institutions here and academic structures here need. There are some general problems which are addressed in these programs, which are global. But then there are local problems local issues that we have in these contexts that require some tweaking, and I think that will only happen by having several of people going through these programs and giving feedback for change, because I think that's where some of the big gaps are. I remember engaging with some of the lab trainers right when this whole program started, and they couldn't understand that it could take more than 3 days to get a consumable. If that's the level of knowledge about the system, so one had to go and talk to people and have them move across various situations that would allow a local flavor to enter into these games. But on the other hand, in terms of interpersonal interactions, in terms of being able to create scenarios and role plays, I think they've created a very nice. That model is very nice, but it needs adaptation.
So workshops of that sort that will orient you how to manage the workforce in an academia is definitely useful. At least it will give you an idea about what problems to expect and how to manage from experts who would help you to understand that. But from my perspective, what I would say is the actual learning happens when you experience the problem and handle the problem at your own level, because the situations may be different from, and you may have a unique problems. So even within the about the student management per se, there are bright students who can connect the dot. You just have to give them the dot. They are just bright enough to connect the dots and move forward. There are people who really needs handholding, and these are things that you need to identify early on. You have to devise your strategy to manage these people in an individualistic manner. So we, as an young faculty, we pay attention to these things, because these things cannot be changed later on in third or fourth year. You have to identify these problems early on and bring them in line quite early on. So people management is also not universal. So it is tailored for individual, and that needs to be understood both for the student as well by the PA. And second thing about the communication, you said about extroverts can survive better. It's not about extrovert or an introvert. It's about building the trust. So how well your student can feel comfortable coming and talking to you about the problems, be it an internal conflict or disagreeing with what you have said to the student. See, I don't agree with what you have said. There is a problem. I have a different independent view. And if you encourage that discussion, then the student will be able to come and talk to you, and you can come up with a different strategy or change your hypothesis of your research. That's feasible. But if that trust is not built, then if they fear that probably I will not be supported, then so that's where the communication again comes. It plays a very important role in building the trust, and trust is mutual. So it's students should trust the PI should be able to trust how long I need to hold hands and when I should let them go free and independent, and encourage their independent ideas. So.
Yeah, so I'm really happy that you brought up the point about, one style of mentoring is not for all students. Like we need to tailor-make it for each student, because that's also one of the points that quite a few students brought up. And I think it's really important that not just the PI, even the student understands what is their PI's mentoring style and what is the best way to approach them. So I think it is definitely a two-way street, and we don't come with this knowledge right away. So if we have trainings for these kind of things, like Riddhesh mentioned that in industry at every level people undergo training for better communication, better management. So if those kind of things can happen, I think they'll definitely go a long way.
A couple of things here. In industry, it is very often taught that you are responsible for your career, not your manager. Right? So manager can change, and your leaders can change, but the whole responsibility of your career, how you drive things, it sits with you. Right? So all the improvement first begins there. So that's about how we have to perceive. So when we set our goal setting, our reviews. Also just adding some of the thing on the communication. So here, yes, there are differences. How an introvert person versus extrovert person respond to a situation. Having said that, there are mechanisms available for everyone. So as far as an introvert is concerned, when it is about his own career, he has to communicate either in writing or verbally, because there is no alternate way to it. So setting clear expectation, making sure there are one-on-one discussions at certain frequencies between manager. So in industry it's manager, and here it is kind of PI. But setting a clear one-on-one meetings already scheduled for an entire year, that once a month you will meet or once in 2 weeks you will meet. Very important. Also tracking, what you made a plan. So for your own research, you may have kind of set the roadmap. Make it granular day by day. and then communicate with your PI and discuss, this is how it is getting achieved or not getting achieved, or there are, concern coming in. So that way the communication become very, very transparent. And also I'll just touch upon about, little bit about conflict management. So conflict management is always one, it should never be closed dialogue. It should always be open dialogue. Somebody who is whether PI or senior, you have to understand that he was also a student at some point. He didn't just become PI, so everyone has gone through that journey. They may have also faced, they may also have their own, peers or student friends who have similar set of questions. The problems never change. What you're facing today were probably existing 20 years before, were existing 50 years ago, and will also exist another 20 years in future. So some way, yes, and keep an open dialogue, seek feedback, respect the senior, and on the senior side, little bit of management responsibility that that kind of bring the maturity and a level of sense of urgency, sense of care, wisdom to their peers and their thing. That another thing which I want to bring, how experience in an organization can be very, very important. So it's not again that your direct manager is responsible for giving you that environment. When I enter in my office, do I have an exchange of greeting with a security person? From there, my day starts. Am I seeing, a lot of peers smiling, giving positive, aura to each other? My day starts from there. Am I feeling happy at a canteen? Am I getting, nice food in my canteen? It impacts. So there are many, many small issues. Do someone gives me a small flower on my birthday, or there is a mechanism where something is arranged, or there's some events where people are given exposure to express themselves, their extra talent beyond the work. So there are many small things where peer-to-peer recognition can also be very important. So your own students can be very strong shoulder to each other. They can recognize, they can understand, and then appreciate in a public forum. So yesterday I was also talking about one of the negative feedback versus positive feedback. Negative feedback should never be given in public. It is always best to have it behind closed walls, either as a committee or as an individual, and deal directly with the person with whom you are having a problem. There's no point of talking it to 20 people who cannot resolve it. It only makes the situation worse. So, and this is how the conflict gets really bad, because people talk to 20 people who have no solution to it. Talk to people who have solution to it, either as a committee or the person directly who is there, and then have a very open-ended dialogue. This is what I would like to say.
Thank you very much, Hridesh, for giving very concrete suggestions on what kinds of things can people everywhere, including in CCMB, can probably work on. So I think this is the correct juncture for me to hand over the mic to people in audience. And Kaushik, who's passing on the mics? So there's a question there already. And I have also a sheet full of questions coming to me, so let me take some time to go through those.
Hello. Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks a lot for your intriguing session today. So based on my experience in the industry and also in the academia, both in the US and in India, so I completely agree with the points that you have mentioned and discussed today. One thing is with the industry, like like Dr. Dikshit has mentioned about the constraints, like the 6 constraints that we actually look into the project management. So here we in the industry we call it as project, like so project management, like the 6 constraints, like the time, cost, scope, the quality, risk, and the benefits. So and each are interdependent. Once we have I think in the industry we have a very limited time compared to the academia. Once we have limited time, the cost increases, but here the costs are probably the budget is given. So and also the risk that is involved. So and also the benefits that are existing in the industry compared to here. So I think those are the constraints that a project is run by. So if the same methodology applies in the academia, I think it would be much easier to manage the project and get better results. That's what I feel like. And again, so with the mental wellness, like what Annapurna has mentioned and Indumati as well. So the mental, I think in the industry, at least in the US, like we used to have a wellness advisory kind of a thing, or a wellness board, where we can actually go there and talk to the counselor about the personal issues or whatever we want to. So I think something like that would be a better idea in the academia, especially even in the academia as well. When I was doing my master's, so there was a counselors who actually help us out. So that's another difference. Like I feel academia should also have. And another thing about I think the benefits that most of the industry has, like they get some perks for your achievements and probably the appraisals, the performance appraisals. So that's the 360-degree feedback that we are talking about. Like once we get the proper feedback and there is an appraisal, performance appraisal, you feel like you need to perform better. So that's another thing I would like to also mention. Overall, I think it's a very intriguing talk, and these are my thoughts based on my experience. I think there are certain differences and similarities between academia and industry, but at the end of the day, I think the project management, how we manage things, even the conflict management or resource management, people management is what is needed in both the industries, or both the industry and academia.
Are there anyone else who wants to share comments or ask questions before I start picking some questions that I have here? All right, let me then ask. When peer researchers receive double the stipend what person X receive, how person X should think about it, since both will be honored with a PhD degree at the end of the day, especially while studying abroad. So basically people want to understand how should one correlate with the amount of money one gets during their academic work, a PhD in this case, and I mean, how should their choices be keeping money in mind? So, Indumati, given that you are probably working with a lot of young students, what's your thought?
I think I understand this as a difference in the fellowships there is.
Difference in fellowship. In India also there's now...
I don't think there is a difference. I think pretty much all funding agencies give the same fellowship.
No, now we have the PM fellowship.
So that way. And also there is also a thought about comparing your standards with somebody who has just moved to industry at the same level but earning high. So, and when you're still struggling to get through your PhD. So that's another thought process that happens as a student. So I think the choice is yours. What is your interest? That you've chosen this as your priority area, and the labs or the projects that you've chosen is out of your interest, right? You have picked the project or picked up the lab where you are going to work in based on your interest today, and also probably for the career that you want to pursue for the future. So look at it as a learning ground where it gives you an opportunity to learn more, and not really as earning. Don't look at it as a job where you're earning. So that's my advice.
All right. Then there's another question on how to deal with conflicts with PIs who are unwilling to implement any changes, and I'll give that to you, Satyaji.
That's a tough one. So I think let me put it this way. I think it's very important to recognize when this sort of an attitude can become a toxic one, and that transition may not become toxic for everyone in the lab. It may become toxic for some or for one. And then, there needs to be some of an institutional engagement where the PIs need to be counseled. Because I think the point, if I'm not mistaken, the persons in the audience, they can correct me. I think the point being raised is if there is some kind of a toxic attitude that is permeating, and that is persistent and not being changed and not being sort of moved on. I mean, if that's the right interpretation of the question, then I think that's a very important thing to be addressed by the leadership in the institute. And it can be addressed. I mean, I think there are ways by which one can move the individual to think differently. Yeah. And it should happen.
Anybody wants to? The next question is kind of an add-on to that. So this is the other spectrum, like people who are willing to make the changes, who are being good mentors. How do we incentivize that?
Well, I think the best incentive for a good mentor is a happy lab.
Happy lab,
Right?
yes.
And I mean, honestly, I think if the lab is not happy, the mentor has no business being happy. So that's one. But on the other hand, I think I just want to say a few things. I think the lab, the institute, we are all microcosms of our society, and I think the continuous need for us to think about, what does that mean? I mean, are we an inclusive place? Are we, willing to go the extra mile and or the extra inch or centimeter or whatever metric you use to bring people in to ensure that there is equity in the way we interact with everyone? And I think that's, and I think the point that was made earlier about somebody being able to come up and say, well, to the PI or to the person who they're working with, you're wrong, and if that environment is not generated, then I can see, issues arising. So I feel that would be my, 2 bits.
So I would like to add one, incentivize, learn to incentivize yourself. Feel happy, like when you're doing you might be doing 10 experiments parallelly. Some may be repeatedly not working and you'll feel depressed and just you go behind it and as a routine and then feel more and more depressed. Rather, feel happy about that 1 or 2 that is working and celebrate that success and feel happy. I think that will keep you moving. Okay, the 10 things I've done, 2 has worked, okay, I'm moving forward, and there are a few things which I will slowly work it out. I'll figure out how things, seek help to figure out, or give a pause and then, so every small success, small excitement in the lab, learn to celebrate. I think that will put down a lot of pressures and will give you a sense of that I'm moving forward, I'm not static, right? So I think that also helps.
Here, I just want to, endorse the same thing both Satyajit and Indumati said. One very important thing which we have to understand, that incentive is not always monetary. So, so there is a monetary incentive and a bigger portion of incentive is non-monetary. If you are good, if you are inclusive, if you are a team player, if you engage people, if you bring all the good human, values, your name and your, presence spreads by its own. Eventually people will get to know you, and when you are not physically present, you will still get a recognition by those people, and eventually your circle going to get much spread. Even your own PhD students, the lab, as they migrate to different places, they are going to carry your legacy. They are going to remember you forever. So that incentive is much larger, which only good people get quite often. So there is always an incentive without even asking.
Right.
Thank you. So the next question is around underutilization of human resources in labs. So somebody is asking, some PIs consider project staff more of a technical assistants and not people who are capable of doing research. How do we deal with this? Basically, how do we ensure that every human resource that we have is optimally utilized? So anybody of you can probably address this.
I think I also mentioned this point because quite a few students came up with it. So, I think here it's not just the onus is not just on the PIs, I believe. Even the senior students in the lab or the PhD students or the postdocs, it's also on them to, consider their peers and even people who have joined after them as equals. right? They will not know things about the lab, but they come with their own set of experiences and own set of background, especially if they are from a diverse background. They may bring perspective to your research that you never had. So I don't think we should discount anyone. And if you're a PhD student, especially a senior PhD student, and let's say your peer assigns a project fellow to work with you, and you just treat them as like two hands. That shouldn't happen. And of course, a PI should ensure that none of their students are treating others that way, but I don't think the onus is entirely on the PI. This is individual, and maybe the PI or the institute can take some steps to inculcate these ideals, but I do believe that they should come from within. Like, you should treat people as equals. You should consider everybody capable of doing great things. I think that's the bottom line I like to make.
Cool.
I just want to add, how the underutilization of resource can be dealt with. So one, it again goes an individual responsibility. If you are unable to do justice to your time you're investing, reach out to the people. I mean, industry does have something called timesheets, where every day you write down where did you spend your hours. So, and then that's an institutional mechanism by which you will eventually get to know that how many people are having sufficient engagement, how many people are not having sufficient engagement. And while in academia it may be a bit different because you just have a one project and you are kind of living with that one project for your entire duration. But in industry you do get opportunity to work more than one projects, and timesheet is one way of doing it. And self-revelation. That I need more work, I need more motivation to do that. Yeah, responsibility goes to you. Without any hesitation, people should say that.
Sometimes as a new student, probably these decisions they may not be able to take it themselves. So as a team, so when we work as a team, be a new student or a senior student, you all have, it's important. If it is a good team, people work together, and people who need hand-holding, they will be trained properly. And once they are trained, you'll understand their strength, and probably you will engage them in projects where they can participate. And by doing this, not just the person who got trained will benefit, but also the person who participated in training the person. So you will have joint authorship. So probably your project is not really moving on. By participating in other projects and helping people out, you will also get the contribution from those publications. Therefore, you're not totally relying on your project not really moving, and I'm being pressurized on how will I submit my thesis. All that will not happen if you really start participating in the team and start helping out each other. I think that's another way of tackling the last minute pressure with respect to your own projects. So in that process, you'll also learn to learn many new things out of your own project domain, and it's a win-win situation, both for the lab as well for the other students, other members of the team.
Thank you very much. The next question is more around what kinds of mechanism, I'm rephrasing the question, and that's up to my interpretation. What kinds of mechanisms do we need to have in place to ensure students' interests are protected? There can be conflicts in terms of how they and their lab members or PI look at a certain thing. That can be the research question in itself, or what the student wants to become later on in their life, which might be in conflict with what the PI wants. So the conflicts can be numerous, but are there general structures that you all suggest that we should have in place to protect students' interests?
Is the interpretation that the students' interests are not protected?
Looks like the person feels that way.
Okay. So I think then there's obviously some communication issues which needs, because in general a student is an incredibly valued resource for academia. And if one doesn't cherish and protect that resource, there is no point having a research environment, right? So if the student is not at the center, or the student or the researchers at that level is not at the center of any academic enterprise, then there have to be structural adjustments to that enterprise. But at the same time, I should say that the student also has to recognize that the enterprise is not just about the student. It's also about every element of the system that supports the student, right? And that, I mean, often, I see this in my institution, I see it in other places, that students, many of them feel so entitled that they expect the entire system revolves around them. So, in principle, it should if the student deals equitably with others. But if there are issues of that nature, I think then there needs to be some correction put in place as well. So I think it goes both ways. At the end of the day, the student is the core of this entire research enterprise. The student, and I say the early career fellow, and the institutions need to, take that as the core of their engagement. But having said that, as I said, there needs to be a recognition of this other aspect as well.
So clearly, the students are definitely the core of any research projects, and they are the ones who are going to spearhead and take the project through and through. And therefore, as a PI, we definitely value the importance of a graduate student in the lab, but when it comes to resource management or any constraints, that probably my idea is not given the importance. So the student also should understand probably it is not in the best interest of the lab. So you may have an idea, but idea may be totally deviant from the actual project. So that is where the PI will come in and say, see, this will not work here, and you may have to realign. So not because it's a bad idea. Idea may be great, but it doesn't fit into the project or the question that you're addressing. So that's where your PI's intervention will come, and that doesn't mean that the PI is not supporting. So these are also need to be understood by the students, and that again can be simply communicated. A simple one-to-one discussion will sort all these conflicts and have a better understanding to move forward.
The next question is also targeted at both of you. The person asking has indicated that. Why is there no system where we keep the younger faculty members in an old PI's lab, an older member's lab, and let the younger PI learn things of management from the older person? So, and I have also heard discussions around these all the time. So how do you both, Indumati and Satyajit, look at such a system? Do you see value in it, or this can be adapted to something which is more valuable?
Well, for any institution, a younger PI brings new ideas, new, fresh perspectives. So I think, and also brings a new energy. And I'm not saying that the older PIs lack all that, but many do. I feel it's really important to empower the younger PI as soon as possible, yes. And to create a hierarchy that says, well, I'm the boss here. You're a junior. I think it's not consistent with everything that we've been talking about.
So I think the argument can be both for and against. So as a new PI, many things you may have worked in a great lab, published very well, and say, for example, a faculty coming from abroad to India, the situation here may be different in the lab. So it's good to have mentor internally, and it's always good. And many of us were benefited by great mentors who have supported us during the early few years, and we are really thankful for that. But the other way around is, as an independent faculty, you need to establish your own credibility and ability to manage projects and establish yourself as an independent researcher, right? So there you need some independence, and so if the institute provides the right environment to grow as an individual, I think that's good. So I think you need to have mixed centers, rather than putting a scientist under a senior scientist, you can have mentors assigned to junior faculty who can help and guide them through. Like you can have groups, we can put similar, people working in cell biology to be together, have frequent meetings, discuss problems, and identify what are the ways to tackle the situation. I think that will help. So it's a combined situation will help, I guess.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean to say mentorship is not useful, Indu. It's more that, I strongly believe that individuals' independence needs to be, needs to be respected, and mentorship can only go so far. You don't want to tell somebody how they should be.
I just want to add a comment. So one comment which I definitely want to add here, that ability to deliver something should be delinked with the age. So when we say junior PI versus senior PI, I mean, it is kind of linked with the age and the cadre, but no, talent can exist anywhere. Experience does make a lot of difference, but then talent can play a role at any age. I remember one of the person who was the CEO of Air Asia at the age of 29. So really, the age is not a bar here.
I think another thing which is lacking or probably not predominant in Indian academia is intra-institutional collaborations. So the PIs within the institute, if they start collaborating, they'll know each other's strength, and in the process they'll help each other out. I think that's another thing that's missing. If every institute has a program, something like this, assign some amount of intramural grant to support such inter-collaborative projects, I think that will also help to support particularly early stage career scientists. So, yeah.
So with that, I'll come to the last question, and I'm picking this question because I think it's for a fitting end to this. So, with the need to bring in more funds and grants into research has affected shifting of a research institute to a business model with more accountability and stringent deadlines to provide results. How does this shift of the years have affected the workforce and stress management? And I'll like you to address this.
Yeah, so I think it's about the perspective of what the Institute is tasked to do. I think the different institutes, different places have different expectations. So there are places where academic research, fundamental research is still a focus, and there are places where more product-devised translational efforts are much more the nature of the game. So I think that these two sides are coming closer today as India's sort of changing emphasis on what science is supposed to deliver. So, I mean, as institutions, one needs to be aware of that and create mechanisms where I feel very strongly that basic science and translational research must survive with potentially equal emphasis, if not more, on basic science, because that's where you create deep thinking and you create new ideas. And creating, I think, the systems and structures, we've talked about all that. I think it's really creating a good workplace, and we've discussed much of that. Budget constraints, as I said, has to be the leadership's problem, and it should not percolate into building this, transferring that onto the people who are actually working in these areas. So the vision of the institution needs to think these through. Of course, if you're going to create a structure where all you want is to build products, I mean, companies have a fantastic model for that. Why do we want to do anything different?
All right. If there's no other questions from the audience, your last chance if you want. All right. If there are no other questions from the audience, I'd like to close the discussion here and leave you all with the note that in the discussion today, I think that we realize that every level in academia has their roles charted out. While we need to understand our roles, there also needs to be effective communication management, conflict management strategies between each of these layers. And there are enough examples out there already to adapt for our own systems, but nevertheless, we need to acknowledge these and understand that academia runs because it's a place where fresh ideas are generated, and that's the thing that keeps us moving, and we can work towards that. With that, I'll close the discussion, and thank you all for joining me today.
I would like to request the panelists to be on the stage. So, thank you all the panelists for the great suggestions, and special thanks for Dr. Somdatta for the excellent moderation. And I would say that it is an intriguing panel discussion, and it was a great eye-opener for everyone who is present here.
We now request our Dean of Student Affairs and Chief Scientist at CCMB, Dr. Manjula Reddy, to please give mementos to our panelists and the moderator. Starting with Professor Satyajit Mayer. Dr. Ridesh Dixit. Dr. Indumati Mariyappan. And Annapurna PK. And finally, for the moderator of today's session, Dr. Somdatta. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you all for your attendance. Now we are breaking for the lunch. Please assemble back here by 1:50 p.m. sharp for the afternoon session of the Founders Day. Thank you.